Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I do apologise. Mr. Burren's actually at the hospital with his daughter at the moment. He sends his apologies. He is going to try and join the meeting in a moment, but he's just let me know that the doctor's popped in, so he will try and join us if he can. I really appreciate everybody joining this morning. Okay, so thank you very much. I appreciate everyone's got their own time constraints and you're all very busy, so thank you for joining us. You're probably more aware of who Mr. Burren is. He's the Deputy Head with responsibility for inclusion at the school. I've put his email address there. My name is Andy Tallett. I'm the Assistant Head of the Primary School with responsibility for assessment and reporting. So Mr. Burren and I work closely on the reports that we send home to parents. We work closely on the assessment systems that we use within the school. Okay, so if you haven't met me, I'm predominantly in the primary school, but I do work across the school with Mr. Burren, particularly for our Pathways 3 assessment and reporting. The purpose of today is for me to give an overview on assessment and reporting, give an explanation of why we've revised the levelling model and what impact that's having, and the amendments that has made to our school reports. There will be an opportunity to ask questions. You can write in the chat. Mrs. Hancock will stay on the chat and she can pass those on to me as we go through, or we can address some of those at the end. If there's anything that's particularly related to the Pathway 3 that I'm not familiar with, then what we'll do is David and I can meet shortly after this and we will put together a guide or an FAQ document and share that with everybody. Just so that I know that this is reaching the right people, this is intended for parents of children in both our early intervention class, which is RGR, taking students from 3 to early 5 years old, and our Pathway 3 classes, which I've listed there. The image at the bottom shows how that spreads across both the primary school and the secondary school. So Pathway 3 is continuous between the two schools. And that's largely what's affected our decision to revise the model this year. Hopefully you're all fully aware of this, but I just wanted to highlight some of the ways that we keep parents informed throughout the year. I can see Mr. Burren's just in the waiting room, so I'm just going to admit him. Good morning, Mr. Burren. So there's many ways that we keep parents informed, and these are probably the more formal milestones throughout the year. You are, of course, aware that you can email teachers anytime that you need to, and we have many parents that collect children, so they are having those informal discussions perhaps at the end of the day. But we do have those termly parent-teacher conferences. It's particularly where we review and set the ILP targets. We have the termly reports that go out in the last week of each term. And then we also have those more regular weekly roundup messages and Edmodo pictures and so on. So why did we introduce a new model this year? The previous model that we used was based on 2 different systems, both of which have now been withdrawn in the UK. This was, one of those systems was called the P scales, which was a system created for children with additional learning needs. That ranged from 1 to 8. So for example, on the reports, we would say that a child might be working at P5 or P6. We then also used the national curriculum levels that range from 1 to 5. And because we're aware that children would make smaller steps of progress, we introduced sub-levels for those. So you might have 1.1, 1.2, or 2.3 and so on. We recognise that this previous grading system was quite technical, so we wanted to review that. So we've been working on a bespoke model tailored to the children at DCIS. In particular, we've looked at replacing a previous digital assessment tool that we used, which was known as B Squared. You may or may not be familiar with that, as it's a tool that was just used by the teachers. And the purpose of this is that we wanted a single model that covered the entirety of the Pathway 3 at Dovercourt, so right the way through from primary to secondary. And we wanted it to be a single system rather than that previous model that worked across 2 systems. Just so you can see where that fits in with the rest of the school, we have our early intervention class. Okay, and for that, we actually base it on the age bands from the Development Matters. I'll talk about that a little bit more in just a moment. And then you can see in Pathway 3, we now use a level system that ranges from 1 to 16. So you can see it's a bespoke model to the early intervention class and to Pathway 3. So what are the changes that we've introduced this year? So in our early intervention class for those 3 to 5 year olds, we've switched to moving the Development Matters document, which is a framework used in the rest of our early years provision, or our early years foundation stage, as we call it. And that's based on a number of early learning goals. So it's goals that children are working towards that are age related. And then in years 1 to 12, so children ranging from ages 5 to 17 or possibly 18, we are using this new system that's a range of levels that go from 1 to 16, which covers all ability, and that will work across key areas or subjects. And as part of that, we've introduced some new digital progress trackers that are bespoke to our school that are really helping to teachers to accurately assess the children. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment as well. And as you would expect, we've had to make a slight adjustment to our reports to reflect this new model. So I'll just talk briefly about the early intervention class. As I've said, we use the Development Matters framework. We recognise that children will be working at their own rates, and this model is really important to reflect that, so it can really break down to the age band that a child is working at. So we now give an age band for each of the prime and specific areas, which I'll show in just a moment, and there are the age bands at the bottom. It's really worth pointing out that there is overlap in these age bands because it reflects that the progress is measured on a continuum. So as you can see, the first band goes from 0 to 11 months, whereas the second band then starts at 8 months and so on. And that's the same throughout all the age bands. As you can see, that the last age band on that system is for children when they hit 5 years old. So it's when they've met those skills that are age related for 5-year-old children. Okay, just said there that the prime areas cover personal, social and emotional development, physical development, communication and language. So those are seen as key things that children should be focusing on first in their education. And then we move on to specific areas which you might recognise as subjects that then follow throughout the school. So we have literacy, we have maths, we have understanding the world and expressive arts and designs. So this is the part that's completely brand new to our school this year. This is what we are referring to as our progress levels. You would have seen this on the second page of the report that went out in December. We also shared at the time an FAQ document and some slides to explain this, but we wanted to give parents a chance to ask us any questions that they might have about this. What you can see there is that this model has been designed to be really personal. Children can start at any point on this that is relevant to them. So our teachers have been working really hard in the first term to make sure that we are pitching or we're setting the children at the right level to begin with and then pitching the work to match that. We've worked really hard to make sure this is comparable. We know that children sometimes move school, but we also know that parents want to understand where their children are in relation to children working at other schools. So we've added in the second column there that shows how this corresponds with age-related expectations at each key stage. And again, we really want to make that point that it is individual, it's progressive. Children will move through these at their own pace. I'll talk about this a little bit more at the end of the presentation when I go through some of the FAQs. What do the levels mean? I understand entirely that this could be a little bit confusing. So basically the first 6 levels are what we refer to as pre-key stage standards. So they're not the same as those Development Matters bands. They are particularly for children that might have additional learning needs. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment as well. So level 1 would be the earliest stage that we could accept a child to Dovercourt International School based on the provision that we have here. This would be the highest level of dependence. We wouldn't expect children perhaps to be starting at that. They would probably start a little bit higher than that and then move through the levels from there on. Level 7 would be where we move on to skills that you would expect that are age related for children in year 1. As you can see, it says key stage 1 on the right hand side there. So level 7 and level 8 are based on the key stage 1 expectations. And then right at the top of the scale, if children are reaching levels 15 or 16, then we'd say that they are IGCSE ready. Those children would be working independently. They'd have all the skills that they would need to be going on to sit their IGCSEs. So as you can see, most children are going to fall somewhere between those levels and will move through this at their own pace. So what are those pre-key stage standards? What we've done is we've taken lots of the statements that we found very useful from the previous P scales, and we've called them our pre-key stage standards. So they are what we refer to as the building blocks, moving children from the development matters onto the national curriculum. They bridge the gap, as it nicely says there. And the teachers will give an overall judgment that they're constantly observing what the children are doing in class, which skills they are able to do more independently, which ones they need a little bit more adult support with, and they're watching that all the time, and they give an overall judgment for each subject based on that. How do we track progress in lessons? So all the teachers have been introduced to our new digital tracking tool. I've given an example of it there on the screen. Teachers will be continually observing. So this is every lesson, this is every snack time, every break time. This is conversations with other professionals in school, whether that's therapists, whether that's specialist staff. One of the things that we really take into consideration when we're using these digital trackers is that we look at the amount of support that children need for each of those skills. And that ranges from it being adult-led, going through frequent support, occasional support, until they are fully independent with those. Okay, so that's an extra strand that we wouldn't use in our other learning pathways at the school quite as much, but that's what we feel is really important in our pathway 3 provision. And as you would expect, our teachers are working very hard to give opportunities that are just at the right level for every child. So it's a really bespoke curriculum that children are receiving. And obviously, as we add more and more data to these trackers, it allows teachers to really hone in on what skills children should be working on next and when they're ready to move up to the next level. I've given an example here of some of the math statements, so you can just have a look at those. It's really important to point out that we don't expect children to be completely independent in every skill before they can move on to the next level. We recognise that children might have areas within, let's take maths as an example, they might have skills within that they can do independently, but there might be some areas, for example, division or maybe multiplication, where they might still require more adult support. So all that is taken into consideration and all that is built into the tracker. Teachers can indicate the amount of support the children need for each of those skills. How is that reflected in our reports then? So as I've said, we've had to tweak them slightly to allow for this new model when we are reporting, and I'll show that in just a moment. We really wanted to make sure that this is as clear as possible. We understand in the past that when we had those two systems, that when we were giving percentages for how far children were through a particular level, that it could have been clearer. So we've worked really hard to simplify that and make sure it's as clear for parents as possible. We also want our reports to be as transparent. We don't want, when you receive that report, for it to be the first time that you're hearing what particular level your child is working at. We want that conversation to be going on throughout the term. So what happens at the parent-teacher conference is reflected in the report. So we've worked really hard on transparency that parents know exactly what level their child is working at and how they can, how that corresponds with age-related expectations. So for children in our early intervention class, as you can see on the screen there, it says which particular areas are reported on. And as I said earlier, the new part this year is that for those primary specific areas, we actually use the age bands from the Development Matters framework. And in Pathway 3, the reports look fairly similar. There's lots of similarities throughout the reports. We do have an additional section in Pathway 3 that we refer to as life skills in primary, and then that moves on to a subject called ASDAN in secondary. You might be familiar with this as PSHE, Personal, Social and Health Education. We try to make it a bit more friendly by calling it life skills, and ASDAN. PSHE doesn't always mean everything or what it should to parents. And then when we come to reports on maths, English and project work, this is where we've added in the new model this year. So each of these areas will have a progress level that I mentioned before, as well as one of those bandings, either developing, securing or excelling. And that will be based on how many of those skills children have attempted, how many, or the level of support that children are completing those with, and how many we feel that the children have actually achieved from that. So it's quite a complex model, but it does give us an overall progress level and a banding. And then as well as that, on the last page, you will find the specialist areas. So we know that something that's really important to parents is understanding exactly where their child's progress level corresponds with age-related expectations. That's particularly important when children are moving to a new school or a new setting. We've worked really hard on making sure that we have a model that is comparable. We share that with you by showing that diagram that shows how it corresponds with age-related expectations. But if you get to a point where your child is moving to a new school, we would really encourage you to come and discuss that with the class teacher, who can give you all the information that you need. We can then also speak to the next school about exactly where your child is working, what skills they've achieved, what age-related expectation they're currently working on. This is the document that we shared previously. I will make sure that you receive a copy of these slides from today so that you can access this by clicking on the word in the middle there. Hopefully you've had a chance to have a read through these before. I'm just going to pick out a couple of these FAQs that I think are really important to discuss with you today, and they might prompt some questions afterwards. So we have lots of parents, understandably, that want to know if their child is making expected progress. And as you might expect, that's quite a difficult one to answer. There isn't really a definitive answer, particularly in our Pathway 3 provision, for whether children are making expected progress. Progress varies by child, and the nature of it varies from one year to the next. And this can be heavily affected by external factors, as I've said, given some examples there: moving school, moving home, changes in the family setup, puberty, changes in friendships even. So in response to this, we make sure that work is really individualized. We don't set work just for the whole class and expect every child to be able to access that. We differentiate it for every child in the class. And also teachers, as I've said there, are continually monitoring progress. We listen and we discuss with all the professionals that are involved in working with your children, whether that's the occupational therapist, physiotherapist, the speech and language team, our ed psych, or other professionals that might be brought in. I've just identified some particular questions here. Should my child progress one level for each year that they're at the school? That's not necessarily the expectation. As you saw from the levels diagram, it doesn't apply that one level matches up particularly with each year group. What we've tried to do, work really hard on, is where a lot of skills for children to learn, we've made sure that that takes up perhaps one or maybe even two levels. Okay, so we have taken that into consideration. I will just say as well that for all children, not just children working in our Pathway 3 provision, but progress is not necessarily always linear. Okay, so we don't expect children to move up one level per year group. Some children might hit a topic that they find particularly hard, and you might remember that yourself for things like algebra or finding the nth term in maths, where progress can actually become a little bit static for a time. There could be a whole range of reasons why children don't make a continuous progress, but what we hope is that over time children are moving through those levels. Okay, and that's what I've highlighted in that next statement there, that the idea is that during the time that your child is at our school, that they will progress through these levels. We've added in those extra bands of developing, securing, excelling, so that we can show those smaller steps of progress when children are moving through the levels. We've worked hard, as I've already said, with our model and with the diagram that I shared earlier, to show you how this corresponds with age-related expectations. We recognise that children, particularly in our Pathway 3 provision, will work at a level that is personal to them, and please rest assured that all work in the class is bespoke to your child. It is differentiated for them and their needs. There might be occasions where on a report that you find your child is judged to be at the same level. This is perfectly normal. As I've said, we don't expect children necessarily to move through a whole level every year. We don't necessarily expect children to always move through to a new band each term. So from developing to securing, they might stay at exactly the same band. Please don't be alarmed with that. You feel free to discuss that with the class teacher, and then the teacher can share with you exactly what skills the children has been working on, and they can go into the level of support that's needed for each of those skills so that you can get that minute detail. Okay, so that's my overview and introduction, and hopefully that's given a little bit more information about why we've introduced the new model, the explanation and the reasoning behind it, how it's going to have an impact on reports.